In the summer of 1942, in the high mountain pasture country east of Helena, Montana, an American lieutenant colonel named Robert Tryon Frederick took command of a newly authorized unit that did not yet have a name, and that did not yet entirely exist. The unit had been authorized by the combined chiefs of staff in April 1942 as a joint American and Canadian commando formation for a specific operation, a winter raid against the German hydroelectric plants in occupied Norway that the combined chiefs would in fact cancel before the unit was ready to deploy. The cancellation left Frederick with a fully formed and intensively trained joint commando force, no mission, and instructions from Washington to find something for the unit to do that justified the cost of its creation. He found it. By the end of 1943, his force had taken a German-held mountain at Monte la Difensa in central Italy that two larger Allied attacks had failed to take. By 1944, his force had been so feared by German troops that a captured German officer's personal diary referred to the unit as Die schwarzen Teufeln, the Black Devils, for the practice of smearing boot polish across their faces before night infiltrations. The unit was the first special service force. Its post-war institutional lineage runs forward, through the U.S. Special Forces lineage of the Cold War, to the Green Berets, to the Navy SEALs, to the United States Army Delta Force, and in Canada to the Joint Task Force II. The brigade that trained in the Montana mountains in the summer of 1942 was the prototype of every modern Western Special Operations force. Frederick was 35 years old when he took command. He was a West Point graduate of 1928, an artillery officer by training, and a planning officer by recent assignment to the Operations Division of the U.S. War Department. The proposal to create a joint commando force had come, originally, from a British scientific advisor named Geoffrey Pike, working under the British Combined Operations Headquarters in 1941. Pike had argued that Allied raiding operations into occupied Norway could destabilize the German position in Scandinavia and force diversionary German troop deployments away from the principal European theaters. Pike's specific proposal called for a force of approximately 2,000 commandos trained in Arctic warfare, parachute insertion, mountain climbing, ski mobility, and demolition, with a specialized snow vehicle, Pike's own invention, called the Weasel, that could carry the force across glacier and tundra. The combined chiefs of staff had approved the broad concept, the joint U.S.-Canadian composition of the force, and Frederick as commanding officer. Frederick had been given 6 months, the use of Fort William Henry Harrison outside Helena, an authorized strength of 2,400 men, and a budget. He had selected his deputies and his training cadre from existing American and Canadian airborne and commando formations, and had begun training at Helena on July 20, 1942. The training program was unprecedented. The first Special Service Force trained in parallel for parachute insertion, ski mountaineering, glacial movement, demolition, hand-to-hand combat, marksmanship, and small unit tactics. Each soldier completed all of the courses. The training day ran 15 hours. Casualties from training accidents, climbing falls, parachute injuries, ski breaks ran at approximately 1% of strength per month through the autumn of 1942. The training cadre was hard. The standards for graduation were higher than for any other American or Canadian unit of the war. The soldiers who completed the program were, by the assessment of every officer who later commanded them in combat, the most thoroughly trained infantry the Western Allies fielded during the Second World War. The first Special Service Force was, in October 1942, ready for its Norway operation. The operation was then cancelled. The combined chiefs concluded that the strategic priority had shifted to the Mediterranean and to the eventual cross-channel invasion, and that a winter raid in Norway no longer justified the resources. Frederick was informed of the cancellation in December 1942. He was given several months to find a new use for his force. The force was committed to the Aleutian Islands campaign in the spring of 1943, where it took part in the recapture of Kiska, an unopposed landing, since the Japanese garrison had withdrawn before the attack, and conducted reconnaissance and combat patrols against expected Japanese forces that did not appear. The Aleutian deployment was operationally minor and produced no significant test of the force's training. Frederick lobbied the Allied theater commands through the summer of 1943 for a Mediterranean deployment. The deployment came in the autumn. The force was transferred to the Allied Fifth Army in Italy in October 1943 and assigned to the U.S.II Corps as a specialized assault formation. Its first major engagement was the Monte la Difensa operation in December 1943. Monte la Difensa was the central peak of the Camino Difensa Maggiore mountain ridge, blocking the U.S. Fifth Army's advance up the Liris Valley toward the Gustav Line south of Cassino. The mountain rose to roughly 1,900 feet above the surrounding terrain, with its southern face, the only practical route for an attacking force, consisting of near-vertical rock cliffs reinforced by a series of German defensive positions held by elements of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division. American and British attempts to take the position in November 1943 had been repulsed with high casualties. The mountain was reputed in Allied Fifth Army headquarters to be impregnable. Frederick was assigned the position in early December. He selected the night of December 23, 1943, for the assault and chose the southern cliff face, the route the Germans considered impossible as his approach. The assault was conducted in heavy rain and sleet at night. Approximately 600 soldiers of the 1st Special Service Force, with climbing rope, pitons, and individual loads of roughly 70 pounds of equipment per man, climbed the southern cliff face of Monte la Difensa across approximately 3 hours of vertical movement. They reached the summit at approximately 3 a.m. on December 3 and engaged the German defenders at close range before dawn. The German positions on the summit were taken within 90 minutes of the initial contact. By dawn, the force held the summit. The German counterattacks that followed across the next 4 days were heavy. The force was reinforced by elements of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division on the 4th day and by elements of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, and the position was consolidated. By December 6, the German forces had withdrawn from the Camino Difensa Ridge. The Fifth Army's advance up the Liris Valley resumed within days. The cost was severe. The 1st Special Service Force took approximately 73% casualties across the 6-day operation. The force's combat strength was rebuilt with replacements through January 1944, after which it was committed to the Anzio beachhead. The Anzio campaign produced the engagement that gave the force its enduring nickname. The Anzio beachhead, established in late January 1944, had become by late February a static defensive line south of Rome under continuous German counterattack. The 1st Special Service Force was assigned to a section of the beachhead perimeter at the right flank, opposite German troops of the 715th Infantry Division. Frederick adopted a policy of aggressive night patrolling. Small groups of his soldiers, faces blackened with boot polish, infiltrated through the German lines at night, killed German sentries silently, left calling cards with a personal warning to the German commanders, and withdrew before dawn. The cards read in German, "Das Dick End kommt noch, the worst is yet to come." The German troops opposite the 1st SSF lost dozens of sentries over the course of February and March 1944. A captured German officer's diary in early April, recovered by an American patrol, referred to the unit as Die Schwarzen Teufeln, the Black Devils. The nickname stuck. The force adopted it formally as its informal designation through the rest of its operational life. The 1st Special Service Force was disbanded in December 1944, after the Allied breakout from Anzio and the advance to Rome and beyond. The U.S. component of the unit was reassigned to existing U.S. Army Airborne and Ranger formations. The Canadian component was reassigned to the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. The unit's lineage was preserved in U.S. service through the establishment of the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, in 1952. The Special Forces traced their institutional descent specifically to the 1st Special Service Force in their early post-war doctrine documents. The Green Berets in turn produced the institutional lineage that runs through Vietnam-era Special Forces, the post-war U.S. Army Ranger Battalions, the U.S. Navy SEALs, and the U.S. Army Delta Force. In Canada, the Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit, established in 1993, traces its institutional descent specifically to the 1st Special Service Force as well. The Black Devils' organizational, doctrinal, and training lineage runs forward through every Western Special Operations Unit operating in 2026. Robert T. Frederick was promoted to Brigadier General in March 1944 and to Major General in June. He commanded the 1st Airborne Task Force during the Southern France invasion in August 1944 and the 45th Infantry Division in Germany in the final phase of the European War. He was wounded 8 times in combat across the war. He retired from the U.S. Army in 1952 as a Major General. He died in 1970 at the age of 63. His personal papers are at the Carlisle Barracks Military History Archive in Pennsylvania. The training camp at Fort William Henry Harrison outside Helena is preserved as a Montana State Historic Site. The graves of the first Special Service Force soldiers killed in combat are at U.S. military cemeteries across Italy, France, and the United States, and at Canadian war cemeteries at Cassino and at Benny-sur-Mer in Normandy. The Brigade Frederick, built in 1942 in the Montana mountains, lasted approximately 28 months in operational service. Its lineage is in every Western Special Operations formation 80 years later. The fact of the lineage is the fact that matters. A few specific combat actions illustrate the force's operational style. At the Pian di Vico Ridge in central Italy in January 1944, a single platoon of approximately 30 1st SSF soldiers under Captain Larry Piet infiltrated through German lines at night, conducted a 4-hour deep patrol, identified the location of a German artillery battery, called in coordinated artillery counterfire that destroyed the battery, and withdrew to friendly lines before dawn with no casualties. The action was the kind of small unit deep raid that the force had been trained for. The intelligence it produced reduced the rate of German artillery fire on the Allied positions for several days. At Sarasola, near Cassino in February 1944, 2 companies of the force conducted a daylight assault against a German strongpoint that had been blocking the U.S. 36th Infantry Division's advance for 3 days. The assault took the strongpoint in 45 minutes at the cost of 18 wounded and 3 killed. The German losses included approximately 70 killed and 110 captured. The exchange ratio was characteristic of the force's combat record. Across its operational life from December 1943 through December 1944, the 1st Special Service Force inflicted approximately 2,300 German killed, 1,200 wounded, and 7,000 captured against its own losses of approximately 400 killed, 1,100 wounded, and a small number of missing. The Anzio breakout in May 1944 was the operation that brought the 1st SSF out of the relentless trench warfare of the beachhead and into the advance to Rome. The force took the Borgo Sabatino sector of the breakout perimeter on May 23, 1944, opening the way for the WWII Corps' advance toward Anzio-Albano Road. They cleared the German rear positions at Borgo Sabatino in approximately 6 hours of close-quarter combat across irrigation ditches and farmhouses. The force then advanced north through the Pontine marshes toward Rome, taking a series of small engagements at the village of Aprilia and at the Mussolini Canal. The unit entered Rome on June 4, 1944, 2 days before the Normandy landings. They were among the first Allied formations to reach the city center. The force was withdrawn from the line in mid-June for refitting, and was committed to the southern France invasion, Operation Dragoon, on August 15, 1944. The Dragoon landings on the French Riviera produced the force's last major operational deployment. They cleared the islands offshore of Hyères, secured the Allied beach approaches, and advanced north into the Maritime Alps before being withdrawn for reassignment in November 1944. The disbandment order came on December 5, 1944, at the French town of Villeneuve-Loubet. The unit's after-action reports preserved at the U.S. Army Center of Military History contain a particular note from January 1944 that historians sometimes return to. Frederick had been asked by 5th Army Headquarters for an assessment of his force's operational sustainability after the Monte la Difensa losses. His written response described the force as combat effective, but warned that the standard of replacement training in the U.S. and Canadian Army programs was not equal to the standard the 1st SSF required. He proposed a 6-week supplementary training program for replacements before they joined the force in the line. 5th Army approved the program. The supplementary training was administered at a small facility near Naples through the spring and summer of 1944. The replacements who passed through it were assigned to the force at a rate that allowed combat strength to be maintained at approximately 70% of authorized strength through the Anzio and Rome operations. The supplementary training program was, in its way, a small institutional innovation that prefigured the post-war Special Forces' insistence on prolonged individual training rather than standard infantry replacement procedures. The training site at Fort William Henry Harrison deserves a fuller description. The fort had been a U.S. Army cavalry station from the 1890s until the mid-1930s and was sitting effectively unused in 1942. Frederick selected it specifically for the surrounding terrain. The Bull Run Mountains east of Helena offered the steep grades, the snow conditions, and the elevation needed for the training regime he had designed. The cantonment area was a square mile of barracks, mess halls, and training facilities. The training ranges extended into the high country for approximately 10 miles in 3 directions. The soldiers lived in the cantonment and trained in the back country on a daily rotation that ran 6 days a week for 16 weeks. The Canadian soldiers who arrived at Helena in August 1942 were billeted in the same barracks as the American soldiers and were trained in the same companies under the same officers. The integration was deliberate. Frederick refused from the beginning of the program to maintain separate American and Canadian subunits within the force. The soldiers were assigned by capability and experience, not by national origin. The integration held through the entire operational life of the force. The Canadians and Americans called each other by first name, ate at the same tables, and went into combat in the same fire teams. The unit's post-war veterans associations met jointly in Helena every year for the next 60 years, until the last surviving members of the original force began to die in the early 2000s. The men who served in the 1st Special Service Force came to the unit through a specific screening process that Frederick had designed in the spring of 1942. The Canadian Army's recruitment for the unit focused on volunteers from Western Canadian provinces with hunting, trapping, and mountaineering backgrounds, with parallel volunteers drawn from existing Canadian airborne formations. The U.S. Army's recruitment focused on volunteers from the U.S. Army's airborne training program at Fort Benning and from existing U.S. Army Ranger and Special Forces formations being stood up in 1942. The screening criteria emphasized physical condition, marksmanship, navigation skills, and individual judgment. The screening eliminated approximately 40% of initial volunteers. The soldiers who completed the screening were, on average, older and more experienced than typical American or Canadian infantry. They were also, in significant numbers, men who had been in trouble with their previous unit's discipline systems, men whose individual judgment had made them difficult to manage in conventional infantry settings, but who became, in the 1st SSF small unit operational doctrine, exactly the soldiers the unit needed. Frederick was tolerant of unorthodox personality. He insisted on competence.